In this video, I, Brew Wizard, would like to talk about optimal learning. And optimal learning is a type of learning that I've discussed before, and it's another concept that I've instantiated and substantiated. And it pertains to our capacity to tap into our optimistic optimizers and improve our learning capacities alongside positive well-being, our direct experiences in regards to not just the qualities direct to our subjective experience, but exploring the qualia and constantly learning in every potential experience, because the mind and the way subjective-objective relationships that constitute various psychological functions in regards to our direct perception, which is going to be most important for optimal learning, and in particular this perception-dependent learning, in which is where we initiate learning and where we see a process of instantiation. So you hear this termed a lot, and a term that I use a lot, and that's for a reason, well, a particular purpose. I do it on proposito, and that's because what instantiation is, it's more of a fluid dynamical process in which we take in information immediately, and we don't store all information, but what we tend to refine more and consolidate more in what's novel and different, and which we say develop a terminology for and instantiate meaning interpretations, or we record these meaning interpretations first, and the original meaning interpretations that we record are these instantiations. And as we learn and we develop and we refine that, that's when we're moving into a substantiation process, and that's consolidated, and it makes more accessible our initial instantiations. But the initial instantiations are probably the most difficult to do, and they're more difficult to do even as we start beginning learning and the processes of learning and learning more deliberately. And there's different categorical processes of learning that it's important to discuss, but learning also tends to fall under more of a broader category in regards to how we form memories, how we establish knowledge, and also perspective. And that's very, very important for learning, is developing a perspective that guides us in a particular direction in which we perceive meaningful information, and also can grant us greater cognitive flexibility within a particular operating domain. And oftentimes what we need to do when we're commencing learning, before we can actually get to optimizing learning, is to actually start off with more structured learning. And so you might see somebody who's actually like an expert learner or very masterful in their learning, and they seem to just be able to learn everything near immediately. But they didn't start off like that. They had to start off with a more structured approach, and even focusing on very like single concepts. And oftentimes, even before you start to instantiate anything, you have to actually paradoxically break it down into at least two categories. Well, two fundamental categories that you usually start off with. But as you move up in greater complexities of learning, you compound information, because you have those access to those priors, and the structures of the brain have already been established, right? So it's a different set of inputs and outputs. And when we're talking about optimal learning, we're talking about increasing our capacity to access a large range of cognitively flexible, say, implementable terms, in which we established a quite deep terminological basis for, and have access to, and can use interchangeably within particular contexts. And not every context, because it's typically domain specific, and it has to be appropriate. And so oftentimes, even when you're learning anything, you're going to hear these terms. Something has to be valid and true in regards to being able to discern whether or not it's an accessible, workable category that's appropriate to the domain of application, and that can actually coherently make sense in a cogent way, and that you can, say, apply to be able to perform a series of perception, action, and behavior apparatuses in association with various repertoires for learning. So let's say drawing, there's various processes that you need to acquire first, say maybe having a basic understanding of shapes, and then being able to, so here's the perception part of it, being able to recognize, say, those shapes in the environment, and then the action, maybe take that perception and then convert it into trying to imitate that shape. And then maybe if you're trying to, say, move from like copying or the imitation process to a more creative process that's original, you're trying to conjure up things that you've seen in your mind, but you're using prior categories learned that are valid and true, and they have to be valid and true for those categories to be operational, and that requires you to undergo a validation process. And luckily, after you've really developed that through more of a conscious, direct perceptual process, what happens is it tends to become semi-automatic or more automatic, so you don't even have to always access the primary bases for learning, but they're usually always still there, and they're not too far to access. And as you become more masterful in your learning, they become much more easier to access and to use in a multitude of different ways, and that's associated with this cognitive flexibility that has to do with broadening a range of meaning interpretations. And so that can also, having that greater accessibility can also increase the processing speed of information within a particular domain. But in some regards, if you're not too, you don't have too much range across different domains of learning, sometimes you can have this information paralysis when it comes to accessing certain terms because it's not applicable to a particular domain, or somebody might have a same term that has a completely different meaning interpretation to you. So what's behavior? I'll use behavior as an example. So a psychologist is going to view behavior very differently than a physicist, because a physicist is looking at, say, the behavior of quarks and atoms, which are these very, very small little building blocks that were originally philosophized to be what composes all of matter and nature and everything around us and thingness, all aspects of the physical universe, or even the cognitive universe you can think of, because atoms are not necessarily just material. They have immaterial components that we recognize in regards to information and the constitution of information, but they're fundamentally physical, I would say, because I'm more physicalist in regards to my understanding and interpretation, meaning interpretation, and that's ultimately true, because the first people who even posited and developed theories in regards to any sort of atomic theory or atom were physicalists, and they believed things were made out of matter and structures and also substance based, and that originates from thinkers like Epicurus, Aristotle, and even myself. I started with a substance based version of reality and understanding of that's material and immaterial in nature, so it has a subjective and objective nature in relation to it. And I just completed a book on synthetic materialism, or my book on metaphysics, and which I discuss in depth these synthetic material relations that aren't the same thing as materialism, and I will distinguish that here very briefly in this video because it's very, very important. Materialism pertains to physical priors, and priors that don't have a subjective element to it, and that's important and necessary to understand, because often a lot of how good physical science is done, different than psychology and the philosophy of psychology, they're fundamentally different, because we're talking about perception, and if we're talking about perception at all, we have to include subjectivity, and we have to start about discussing perception, action, and behavior from a standpoint that is synthetic material and pertains to the origins of life. And that's emergent from what's a necessary materialist prior, and it couldn't otherwise be or exist. And to get to there, you need to start with an unmoved mover or an objective mover. But when we're discussing psychology, this doesn't make sense. It breaks down completely. And we have to talk about subjective-objective relationships, always. You can't get past that. And so when it comes to understanding things like this earth and concepts of terraforming that have direct subjective-objective relationships that must shape and be infused in all material matters. So, like, for example, let's take clothing. It's a material, right? It doesn't have, say, a perception. It doesn't have a subjective experience. It's not conscious. It's a non-conscious object, right? But for you to get clothing, for that to even be constituted, you need to have life prior to that. And even the weather conditions are shaped by living organisms, and the inputs and outputs that make the external environment much more dynamical and characteristically different, and must be categorized differently than, say, Mars before we made contact with it. Because when you have, say, like biomarkers, there's some element of subjectivity that's associated with that process, and which becomes bound up with the environment, and that couldn't otherwise be explained by any other external phenomenon. We have to talk about the emergence of life at some point, and we have to talk about certain materials as having a common origin with the origins of life and couldn't otherwise exist, such as clothing or shelter, rather than just basic structures in the environment. But that doesn't mean that we just get rid of materialism either, because we need to still discuss materialism to be able to discuss any sort of psychological relationship, because there's an objective element to that, and there's certain things that you can't get around, like thermodynamics, and you see that directly in every subjective-objective relationship, because we have to regulate the temperature around us to be able to maintain an appropriate temperature that allows us to sustain our life and existence. We have to consume certain foods that are compatible with various aspects of our body that allow us to hold certain chemical bonds together in more of an intellectual way. So there's definitely a subjective component to that, but there's many material parallels or reciprocal relations between synthetic material processes and material processes, and they're distinct in kind and typology. But so when we're talking about optimal learning, we're going to be much more interested in discussing various cause and effect relationships that pertain to synthetic materialism, because learning is bound up to the emergence of life. Physical objects don't and can't learn in any sort of meaningful way, rather than oftentimes, even when you see, say, like a crystal is something that we can say has certain properties that imitate learning. It can develop and pass on different patterns and repetitions and emergent patterns and repetitions of various structures and configurations to the crystal, and how it's formed and how various molecular bonds are formed internally within it. But it's much more of a linear process and much less dynamic and less situated than living organisms. And another big important concept to optimal learning is going to be this understanding situatedness and situated theory, and our direct relation to the environment, and how we establish the capacity to tap into meaningful information before it's even recognized as meaningful information. Because especially even if you're even coming to develop, trying to think back to like when you're an young child, and you're a toddler, and you're learning your first words, but you're also trying to learn how to make sense of the world. That's a very, very, very difficult process at first that begins with, and sometimes you're using the words in ways that don't even have a well-calibrated meaning interpretation, and so you're just kind of making noises in some sense until you've correctly calibrated that, and a lot of the meaningful information around you is not really meaningful yet. It's meaningful in a different way, but it's not constituted within the individual's subjective experience or direct perceptions as meaningful until you have a more calibrated enough meaning interpretation that can allow you to do things or that you've learned, right? So for example, cooking is a process that requires us to calibrate certain meaning interpretations to our direct perceptions that guide our actions and behaviors in this navigational learning process. It's very, very dynamical. And there's ways of cooking that are incorrect. They don't work. They're inappropriate. And there's an appropriate way of cooking, right? You don't want to, say, overcook your meat and completely burn it, right? Because that's just like burning something. It's not necessarily like cooking. But if you say like you're making a steak, you want to brown it. You want to make sure that it's at least cooked enough so it's, well, I mean, you can eat it relatively raw, but that wouldn't really be undergoing a cooking process. You want to have, say, like if you want like a medium rare steak, you want to make sure that you're not overcooking it past a certain point, that it's still pinky and maybe has like this reddish inside, but it's brown a little bit on the top and the outskirts, and it's quite juicy. Maybe you've buttered it, so there's a seasoning process to it, and it butters the flavor, right? It makes it better. It makes it more savory and flavory. And there's different complexities to that cooking process. Like you might like have a request, say, to have it more well done, and so you want to make sure it's more brown on the inside and it browns through, and that you've cooked it for a little bit longer, and that you've regulated that temperature, but it's also properly seasoned too, because you don't want a dry steak. So some buttering process, or even oftentimes if you say put vinegar on a piece of meat, what the vinegar does is there's these things called proteins, and that's what the meat's really made out of, is these tissues and these structures that are composed of various synthetic material bonds. And that the vinegar allows us to break those bonds down in a more of a microscopic way, that we can actually, if we say combine it with butter or various spices like paprika, what we can do is we can actually get that paprika to go more inside that meat, and then it spreads out that flavor. And sometimes what you see is when you're cooking, say you're cooking a piece of chicken, you might only have the flavor on the outside, and the problem there is it's because people haven't broken down the fats around the outside or through the skin. You can do various things, like you can cut a little bit on where the fat sides are to get meats or the juices to flow in there and the spices to spread out that way. You can use butter. Butter's a great way of actually increasing the flavor in a more savory, flavory way. And that I also, again, substantiated this term. I mean it as a technical term as well, because savoring is a way of actually expanding more thoughtfully our categorization of information. So deepening our categories through our direct experiences, through our direct perceptions, right? We're tapping into what's direct to our perception, and we're exploring it. What is this? We're asking questions, and we're thinking. We're trying to calibrate the terms and words that come to mind with various meaning interpretations to what's direct in our external environment. And this helps us to establish what are called subjective-objective relationships, and more meaningful subjective-objective relationships, that as we become more calibrated, say, to the external surrounds, we can move from more of what's subjectively true to what's more objectively true. And this all, anytime you have a subjective-objective relationship, it's going to pertain to ultimately what's psychologically true and psychological truth, but also specifically as it pertains to when we're talking about synthetic materialism, what's realistically true. And there's, I've anticipated some arguments saying, well, everybody has a different concept of what's realistically true. And what are you going to say to the idealists? Well, if you hear any idealists speak, they always say, let's be realistic about that. Everybody's going to say, like, has a concept of what's realistic to them. And that realism pertains to these subjective-objective relationships. So there's a subjective element to it. So what's realistic to you might not be realistic to somebody else, but there's always going to be a common ground because there's an objective element to it. So you can't get rid of either or. You can't get rid of the subjective or the objective if it's truly realistically true. And what's realistically true isn't always appropriate to categorize in certain phraseology, so the way we speak or communicate, as being psychologically true, because realistically true is much more objective in nature when it comes to, say, psychological truths that are much more contingent. So especially if you're talking about perceptions, actions, and behaviors rather than our relationship to the external environment. So let's say that you're talking about how agriculture should be done, then it might make more sense to talk about realistic truths rather than psychological truths, because I don't really care so much what you think in some circumstance if we're talking about a particular process that is divorced from, my existence or your existence, and it pertains more to how things are actually done, say in regards to how we farm, and how a particular process in regards to farming works. That is more important to talk about objective truths, but also realistic truths, because again, like, these are living things, and they require us to have some concept of subjective-objective relationships, rather than if you're, say, refining physical materials. But in all these cases, it's important to have a good understanding of also what objective truth is. So that's quite a bit for now. And I'll probably discuss this a little bit more going further. But I want to get back to just briefly talking a little bit more about optimal learning and optimizing learning. And there's a lot more to that. So you've heard me, again, talk about all these important subjective-objective relationships that pertain to the emergence of life. And we're talking about optimal learning. We're not just talking about directly what we're learning. We're talking about optimizing the processes of learning. So learning how we learn is a component of it, but also going deeper and understanding how, for example, how the relationship between the mind and the body and the behaviors that we engage in, say even the food that we put in our body, getting proper rest, can improve learning indirectly and directly, and engaging in multiple different domains of learning. So making learning a hobby or something that you do on a day-to-day basis, more deliberate learning rather than, say, informal learning that's happening all the time, right? Even if you travel and say you walked, or even if you say moved to a new location too, if you've walked the same space enough times, you're slowly going to develop memories and knowledge in association with that. But it's not going to be as precise or well calibrated unless you actually engage more agentically with that. And what that means is that you're an agent, but you're also engaging in various processes of agency in regards to perceptions, actions, and behavior. And you're doing that with some degree of effort. It requires us to direct our efforts in a particular direction, to have some sort of objective in mind, and to have thought of things in a more deliberate way, even if it's not as accurate as at first. And having a good understanding of error too, and an appreciation for error, and being able to recognize where the errors are, is going to be important for optimal learning, because we want to make sure that we're calibrating what's not just subjectively perceived and what we might think is true, but also we don't want to also include what's erroneous, say, in our categories that we're coming to learn. We want to make sure that they're, again, precise. So we want to be able to identify what's incorrect, say, about what we think about something, and optimize learning in regards to being able to identify what is more appropriate to us as individuals too. And this is very, very important, that we establish our own meaning interpretations, and we speak in our own words and have our own understandings. And oftentimes what you'll find is other people don't have the same meaning interpretation as us, but we generally converge on a common set of meaning interpretations. And that's what really constitutes the objective element of any subjective-objective relationship. But there's always going to be a subjective element, so everything's always bound to perception, and there's always going to be some variance in regards to how we even perceive the same category of interpretation, say in regards to pineapple or tomato. And tomato's a good one, because not everybody thinks of tomatoes the same. Some people think tomatoes are a vegetable, but it's actually a fruit. And as you tap in deeper, you might not just see a tomato as a fruit, you might see it as a nightshade, and a nightshade that's similar. It's like a big blueberry, and blueberry is another great example, because blueberries aren't actually blue; they're violet. And you can start to see more things more clearly as you can develop more deeper, precise categories of knowledge and refine that. But people have different meaning interpretations in regards to that, and so somebody who might think, well, why do you think a tomato is a vegetable? How do you go about categorizing vegetables? Well, there's seeds inside the fruit typically, and there's usually the seeds on the fruit somewhere. You have the exception of strawberries. Strawberries aren't a vegetable; they have the seeds on the outside. But vegetables, strawberries not a vegetable. It's a fruit, right? It has the seeds on the outside. Vegetables typically have seeds that come from flowers that flower outside of them. So if you think of various fruits, you have, cantaloupe, a fruit, seeds inside. Watermelon, seeds inside. You think of cauliflower, a vegetable, no seeds inside, right? It has to flower. Zucchini, same thing. It flowers, seeds come outside. Very, very different. Beans are a little bit different because they're actually not a vegetable or a fruit. They're legumes. And they're much closer to nuts. So if you think of peanuts have been considered a fruit, but they're a legume, again, too. So they're not quite the same as, they're definitely not a vegetable, but they have a different environment that they grow in. They can grow in caves, for example. But not, it's important to make sure that we can identify things for ourselves and that we establish our own meaning interpretation. That meaning interpretation is well calibrated. And when discussing about meaning interpretation, they're non-arbitrary. They can't be arbitrarily established. So you can't just subjectively perceive whatever you want. And that's actually not how the brain goes. So anybody who has this conception that meaning interpretations are kind of like these loosey-goosey sort of associations that you can kind of like just perceive whatever you want, that doesn't work. It's invalid. It can't be validated. It doesn't operate as psychologically true because you don't actually have any meaningful subjective objective synthesis, and you're not engaging in any meaningful process of learning that moves that subjective category towards the objective. And so what you're doing is you're not even establishing a knowledge process. You're just operating in this meaning process domain, which is a different process, and that's primarily subjective, and it's more closer to meaningless affects. And what an affect is, it's essentially the feeling content of our experiences, the feeling qualities of our experiences. And not all feelings are meaningful, and we know this, but we also know what feelings are meaningful, and there's certain affects that do have a meaning to them. And affect is going to be very, very important when we're talking about optimal learning, because often how we best navigate meaningful learning is to be able to identify the meaningful affects within our experience and to inhibit the meaningless affects. And to be able to appropriately regulate that and form cognitions in association with the proper meaning with regards to the affect or not, because sometimes it's best to just focus on the analytical content or the precise category interpretation if you really, really want to learn something more difficult or comprehensive in regards to its material. But depending on what you're learning, say cooking, having meaningful affects is going to be important, because those meaningful affects are going to be able to tell you, say, information. If you want to know, like, I want to make this tasty, well, there's gonna have to be some sort of meaningful emotion that you tap into and some sort of meaningful affect that you tap into when it comes to, say, learning how to cook, or if you're trying to get a certain effect in terms of a painting or a drawing too. Again, like, these are more based off the qualities and various affects, and they're very, very important there. Again, any sort of like art practice, even in psychology. So if you're trying to, say, break down rigid categories of interpretation, you want to be able to identify what's more meaningful to an individual rather than what's less meaningful to an individual, because people are going to be much more resistant to what's not meaningful to them, because they're not interested in that, and oftentimes they won't even process that information, or they'll just ignore it, or they'll be more resistant to it, and they'll develop often more negative responses to that. So it's very, very important to focus on an individual's psychological needs and to identify those with being able to tap into those meaningful affects rather than the meaningless affects with regards to any sort of experience and learning experiences. And I'll talk more about various ways of optimizing learning that pertain to different regions of the brain. And as we engage in different domain-specific types of learning, we're actually activating different regions of the brain. And so you've heard me just right now spit out a few. I've talked about, say, cooking, learning how to cook and the meaning of affects there, and learning how to, say, draw or paint. and also may even, when it comes to psychology, being able to, like, if you're trying to break down an individual's like rigid patterns of thinking to become more cognitively flexible, to be able to identify that in a much more reciprocal relational way that taps into more of a sensitivity that can identify their psychological needs appropriately. And these all will activate different regions of our nervous system and our brain. And so you have different areas of the body and the dynamical mind that are storing information in different, what are called localized regions in the nervous system. And that's associated with establishing subjective objective relationships that we don't always have direct access to. If you're learned in the nervous system and matters of psychology, then you probably do have more access to them. But individuals who aren't interested in that probably have a little bit less access to those. They're less interested in things like the unconscious mind, and how also the conscious mind directly stores information in regards to various localized regions of the nervous system. How, say, if we were to damage a particular region of the nervous system, that would be could become impaired. Or even when we're sick, sometimes we have depressed functions which reduce or decrease our capacity to perform a set of multifunctions in regards to a set of perception, actions, and behaviors, even experience a higher quality of emotion. But there's very dynamical relationships too. So sometimes you can see even a positive outlook can increase positive affects, where in other individuals who might have, say, a similar injury or be more depressed due to illness that's more physiological, individuals who might be more optimistic in regards to how they just perceive information and how they even go about a particular way of sequencing the words that flow through their subjective experience, their direct perceptions, how they make sense of things. They might that might orient them to actually engage in more appropriate behaviors, or behaviors that are more conducive to improving health, the quality of health. So somebody might say, like, I'm not gonna eat today because I'm feeling terrible and my body just doesn't want me to go cook. But another person might be like, well, I feel horrible today. I don't want to get out of bed, but I know last time when I decided to push through and go cook a meal and actually eat something and get enough rest, that I felt better like the next day after. And that was much better than the other time where I didn't do that. So I'm going to try that again, and I'm going to try to move in that direction. And maybe that ends up working. That ends up generally tending to have positive effects, having more a positive self-talk, or positive expectations of the future. So knowing, say, like, what you can do in a particular situation that will improve an outcome. Now, there are always contingencies and confounding variables, so it's important to also identify those, and I can get into those in a later video. But that's a pretty good overview of various different types of learning, and I've discussed pretty much all of these in, I think, previous videos in some manner. And this is very, very comprehensive. So I'd say this is probably at the level of somebody who's probably going to go to university and has had some level of prior learning. And I'm going to make another video that's much more easier to understand in regards to optimal learning, that will provide a definition that's more accessible even to children. But for right now, I think something much more comprehensive is in order, just because, like, these are very, very new emerging concepts, and concepts that I haven't seen discussed elsewhere, and that are pretty much all based off what I've instantiated and just built from building blocks of my own accord. So anybody who's telling you that, oh no, like, I totally know all of this stuff, ask them, go find it for me, go search it. Like, some of these, you're gonna have to actually read my books to be able to in this, the way it's sequenced and the material synthesized, there's just no way. Like, I don't know how they would do it. It just doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, so that's all for this video. I hope you enjoy. Bye.